You have criticized Rubio and other for weakness and for failing to grasp the importance of victory. You said no one truly wants to follow Putin's model, yet Western democracies appear paralyzed by fear of escalation, while authoritarian regimes like Russia, Iran, North Korea act quickly, boldly, and in coordination. Is that a sign that liberal democracies have lost their strategic nerve? What would have to happen for the West to move from military helping Ukraine hold on to genuinely fighting for victory, the way its emerging authoritarian axis appear to be doing?
Well, this is a decision for political leaders in Europe. Um, I think more and more people are realizing that the best way to defend Europe is to help Ukraine defeat Russia inside Ukraine. Um, that would be worth any investment, um, instead of um, focusing on building up their own defenses. Help Ukraine be successful. That, and my sense is that more and more countries realize that this is uh, a necessity. It's especially if the United States is not going to be doing what it should do, then European countries will have to do it, and they can. I mean, there's enough wealth, there's enough technology. West European defense industries are growing, so um, I think this, and then of course stopping the shadow fleet vessels in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. These are the kind of things that Europe can and should do.
General, you called strikes on Russian oil infrastructure a winning strategy for Ukraine. Last night we saw confirmation of this. The Ilsky refinery was on fire, the Metafrax plant in Permkrai was attacked, and facilities in Sevastopol were hit. You said Putin's feared the moment when a million angry veterans returned to an economy turned to rubble. Does it seem to you that Ukraine's strikes are accelerating Russia's collapse faster than West is prepared for?
Well, it shouldn't depend on the West. It should depend on what's best for Ukraine. What can Ukraine do that would accelerate the defeat of Russian forces so that they have to withdraw and come to the negotiating table, um, versus what's happening now. I think that the path to victory, or the theory of victory for Ukraine, includes the destruction of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure so that they cannot export to China and India and Turkey and other countries. Um, that would include, of course, not just destroying refineries, but also the shadow fleet vessels. And this is where I think European countries could really play a critical role. Also using the frozen Russian assets that Belgium blocked a few weeks ago, providing or investing in Ukraine's defense industry to increase the number of long-range precision strike capabilities. Um, I think that um, to me, this seems like a path to victory, but I can't predict how long that takes.
What do you think is Putin's worst nightmare right now?
All of Europe uniting behind Ukraine. And then, of course, with the U.S. were to act with a strong, use the leverage it has. I mean, that would be the worst nightmare. But we missed our chance. Even during the Biden administration, they did not, because they were, I think, worried about escalation to a nuclear conflict, and the Russians could see that. That's why they would always mention nuclear weapons every 2 weeks. So the Biden administration failed here. The Trump administration is failing for a different reason. At the end of the day, Ukraine is a European country. If Ukraine fails, it will be a disaster for the rest of Europe. So I think European countries are going to have to fill in this gap.
Hmm. In your view, what would be the unmistakable signal that Russia has suffered a decisive strategic collapse and is ready to end the war immediately? What would they look like in practice?
Well, it's honestly, it's hard to imagine it happening with Putin in power. Um, I think he has had Russian soldiers in a war for I think 20 of the 24 years he's been in power. So he is a war president, not a president at war. Um, and he's created a situation now with these hundreds or millions of veterans, an economy that is only focused on the war, and their reliance on exporting oil and gas is a real vulnerability. So I don't know that he can just say, okay, it was a mistake. I'm ready to negotiate seriously now. Um, so I don't know, I, but I think it will be something that's sudden, not gradual. I think inside Russia, finally somebody will decide that's it. I don't know that, um, but it's not going to stop until he stops.
As we come to the end of our conversation, I would like to once again express my sincere gratitude to our guest, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired. General Hodges served as the Commanding General of United States Army Europe. He is a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, and today he remains one of the leading strategic voice on Europe and transatlantic security, serving as a respected senior advisor and expert on regional defense issues. General, thank you very much for being with us today. I truly appreciate your time, service, and your insightful thoughts. Thank you so much for being with us.
Alexander, thank you for the privilege of joining your show, and best wishes to all of you here as we approach the anniversary of the large-scale invasion. But we keep reminding people that Russia invaded Ukraine 14 years ago, and they still cannot defeat Ukraine, and they never will be able to defeat Ukraine.
Stay with the strong Europe, strong world, and strong Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Exactly. Glory to the martyrs.
Afghan war. Do you see any real mechanisms or leaders in Russian society or among political elites today capable of transforming potential streets protests by widows and mothers into an actual regime change?
There's a very short answer to that. Unfortunately, no, I don't see any evidence of their leaders in waiting that would try and build up dissent to take on Putin, because Putin's got massive control over it. If there's any tiny little whisper of dissent anywhere, he uses his security forces to very quickly go and clamp down on it, and individuals get arrested and put in prison for a very long period of time. However, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Something at some stage will stimulate it. And if we look in the early years of Russia's full-scale invasion, Putin had managed to keep most of the reality of what was happening in the front line away from the Russian people, restricting access to international press, restricting what was being said in the streets. However, in more recent years, with Ukraine's tactics of taking the fight into Russia, attacking the oil and gas infrastructure, attacking military factories, and after Prigozhin, the former Wagner lead's attempted coup, then the Russian people have started to become more aware of what's going on, and Putin's narrative has had to change, and his narrative has changed from it being just a war against Ukraine to it being an existential war against NATO and against the West. The Russian people will continue to believe that for a while, but something will trigger them to start to change their views, to start and question it. Am I saying that at the moment? Unfortunately not. But that doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen, and may not happen relatively quickly. And I think 2026 is going to be a decisive year when it comes to this.
Mm-hmm. You noted that the war is reaching losses comparable to the First or Second World War. If this conflict truly turns into a war of attrition lasting over 5-7 years, do you believe European economies are politically ready to switch to full-scale wartime footing to outlast Russia's capacity for prolonged warfare?
I don't think European economies need to switch to wartime footing to what would be described as total war from an economic perspective. Because if you look at the European economies, the European GDP, if you add it all together, is 220, $250 trillion. Russia's economy is $2.3 trillion. Russia is going to go bankrupt much more quickly than the EU, and that's at current rates. Add in the United States coming in with support in that as well, and add in other countries like New Zealand and Australia and everything else, then support for Ukraine can be sustained at current levels and at current levels of expenditure. Now, increasing those levels and increasing the level of support is something that nations, I think, should be considering so that it can give Ukraine even further capability. If Ukraine can absorb it, if it's got the troops, if it's got the ability to continue to fight with more and more weapon systems. The other way to do that is to support Ukraine financially in the development of its own systems. And this is where we're seeing some successful developments, in particular, the sea-borne drones, a lot of the aerial drones that are having good effect on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, and of course the latest Flamingo cruise missile with a huge range. And this is where this is probably the right and proper way for getting good, strong military support into Ukraine. But as ever, it takes time, and that's the one thing that is most painful about this, because time means lives. It means Ukrainian lives in the towns and cities that are being attacked nightly by the Russians, Ukrainian civilian lives. It means Ukrainian military lives on the front line. And, we have to remember that most of the Russian troops that are there are not there by as volunteers. They have been somehow or other forced to the front line, and they've got families as well, and they're human beings. And those casualty figures are enormous. And from a human perspective, you can't but help feel that it is sad that one man, Vladimir Putin, is responsible for so many deaths on his own side, and unacceptable deaths of any number on the Ukrainian side. And this is where Putin has to pay for the crimes that he has committed.
Definitely, yes. Lavrov publicly complained that the U.S. is not honoring the Alaska agreements on joint multi-trillion dollar economic project, forcing Russia to turn to BRICS. Does this rhetoric indicate that Putin's inner circle made a strategic error by expecting Donald Trump to act solely in business interests? Does the Kremlin have a real contingency plan if the new U.S. administration proves tougher than anticipate?
Yeah, there's again a lot in that. There was never a formal agreement out of Alaska. I think this is a typical Lavrov and typical Russian approach to turning around and saying something has been agreed. This is what is going to happen. Whether it's even been talked about is probably questionable. And therefore, it's Lavrov trying to play Donald Trump, because Donald Trump seems to flip-flop between supporting Ukraine and then blaming Ukraine for starting the war, and it's trying to work out what's going on in his head half the time is probably as difficult for Vladimir Putin and Lavrov and Peskov and the Russians as it is for us in the West. And therefore it's gameplay. It's gameplay in the information domain. How is this going to play out in the future? I think we're just going to see an awful lot more of it. I think it's the only thing that Russia's got at the moment is the ability to continue its influence operations, and it's very, very good at its influence operations. Whether that's going to be enough for it to sustain itself, I don't know. And if the United States turns around and throws its weight completely behind Ukraine and away from Russia and starts to take more direct action, can Russia survive? No. I think we'd suddenly find Vladimir Putin very quickly wanting to come to the negotiating table with some concessions, something he hasn't done to date.
You brought up the Flamingo missile strike and the harm to Russia's oil facilities. In your view, could this lead to a swift economic collapse in Russia and the loss of control over Putin's oil assets?
In a word, yes. I think it's the most sensible tactic possible. Russia has to pay for the conflict somehow or other. Russia has to pay China for the support China's giving it. Russia has to pay Iran for the support that Iran's been giving Russia. If Russia can't sell its oil because it can't get it out of the ground, because it can't store it and can't refine it and can't then ship it around the world, then its ability to continue to fund its illegal war is going to become harder and harder and harder. And we're already seeing Russia using a lot of its strategic reserve. We're already seeing the impact that it's having on the domestic economy. We're seeing the impact that it's having in industry with the increased numbers of Russian factories that are unable to pay their workers at the end of each month, and further economic woes brewing very quickly indeed. So I think 2026 is going to be a decisive year economically. If I was whispering in the Ukrainian commander's ears, I'd be saying increase the number of attacks against Russian oil and gas infrastructure as much as you possibly can. The attacks are being very clever. They're hitting key elements of the refineries that are very difficult for the Russians to replace, and they would have to get material that's under sanction from the West to replace it. They're hitting the storage facilities, and the storage facilities mean that oil can't be pumped out of the ground and stored. If it can't be pumped out of the ground, the wells are going to have to be closed down. If the wells are closed down, they can't be reopened again. In many cases, it's virtually physically impossible to do so. So, it's very, very clever tactics in attacking this. I think it is having an impact in Russia and will have a massive impact at some stage soon.
For the final question, February 24 marks the fourth anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As the country continues to endure this horrific and bloody war, what do you think the world has learned so far, and what more needs to be done to support Ukraine right now?
What has the world learned? I think the world hasn't really learned anything properly. And that's a very sad thing. We have got three major conflicts brewing around the world or being fought around the world. We've got in Europe, Russia, Ukraine. We've got in the Middle East, the Iranian influence and what's happened in Gaza and what's happened with Hezbollah in Syria and the Houthis in Yemen. And that's only potentially getting worse. It isn't going away, hence why we're seeing such a huge US military build-up. And then, of course, we've got Southeast Asia. We've got Chinese expansionism throughout the Paracel and Spratly Islands. We've got the Americans and Japanese moving anti-ship missile systems closer to be able to support any Chinese action against Taiwan. We've got Xi Jinping becoming increasingly belligerent in a lot of the language that he's using elsewhere, and therefore that is, from a longer term perspective, probably the biggest destabilizing influence that there is in the world. And when we look at the links between all of them, they're all linked. We've got Iran, Middle East, we've got China, Southeast Asia, we've got all linked into Russia. We've got this axis of evil that is described, bringing them together, and of course they're all linked in BRICS as well from an economic perspective. So again, it's very, very, very worrying times. The West, I don't think, is even learning the fact that Russia and Vladimir Putin will, if he's given any concessions, come back for even more in the future. Western leaders are saying the right things, but they think differently. And this is something that the West has to wake up to. They think differently because Western leaders are controlled by when their elections are going to be, or what tomorrow morning's headline in the newspaper is going to be. Whereas Putin, the Grand Ayatollah, Xi Jinping think in generations. And this is something that we need to wake up to, and we need our leaders to start to think long term as well, and long term and all linked, instead of trying to treat everything as separate and look at just short termism. Until then, as I've said, I think several times in my programs, I've been at this game, whether in the military or commentating and reporting on it, for over 40 years. And these last 3 or 4 years are the first times I've ever seen, a real path to global conflict, and that worries me.
I want to say thank you, huge thank you for your insightful and deep thoughts, your analysis, your work and your support of Ukraine. Today with us was Philip Ingram, former colonel in British military intelligence, member of the Order of the British Empire and host of Frontline on Times Radio. Thank you so much for joining us and see you soon.
Thank you very much indeed, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!